Good evening, everybody. Rob O'Connor here from RobVenoSports.com. Happy to be back for the 2017 college football season. This is our normal time, Wednesday evening, to take an early look at lines for the coming week. Believe it or not, there are week one lines out already, but that's not what we're going to do tonight. There's plenty of time to get to that. We're going to take an early look at the ACC Atlantic Conference division. We're going to talk about defending national champion Clemson, Louisville, Florida State, and the rest of the pack that'll be chasing those three teams this season. In order to do that, I need to bring in the founder of RobVenoSports.com, none other than Rob Veno himself. Rob, how are you doing?
How are you, Rob? It's a fast approaching college football season here now, so I think we're down to 40-plus days, so it's a good time to go ahead and start covering these conferences from the, what we like to do from a betting perspective and see if we can find any hidden gems on the season, try and do some work for guys that are listening here. Maybe haven't had a chance to look things over yet. Maybe we can get you a couple of things that will be helpful for the upcoming season.
Absolutely, and I don't know about you, Rob, but I am oddly excited about that slate of games on Saturday, August 26th. I feel like it's Christmas come a week early. I don't care if it's Stanford and Rice and UMass and Hawaii. I am pumped for those games.
Yes, there's no doubt about it, Robert. As we always say, if there's a point spread, we're ready for it. So, the matchups don't really matter. We're looking to capitalize by cashing tickets. So certainly having games sooner the better. I didn't know exactly when I was doing my work what to call that week. I guess we'll call it opening week because it doesn't really seem to be week one. There's a few games scheduled on the second. Of course, week one really gets underway on Thursday, the following Thursday. But to have those games on the 26th is nice. I think last year we only had, I can't remember exactly now, but I do remember the California-Hawaii game over in Australia being a real early one. I don't think there were any others besides that. So it's nice to have a group of them.
Yeah, I think this is a bunch of teams taking advantage of the new rule that if you are Hawaii or if you are playing Hawaii during the season, you can start your season a week early, and some teams chose to take advantage of that, which is nothing but a benefit to us. Spread out the games a little more.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like I say, it helps somewhat in your scheduling too, although there are some of these teams, I noticed one in particular where the scheduling is going to be a little rough by starting early, and bye week doesn't come for quite a while. So a lot of ins and outs. Each game is its own entity, as we like to say, no blanket statements on any of these teams. But just to have college football back in general, Rob, very, very exciting. And I know that these preseason magazines seem to hit the stands earlier and earlier every year. Most of the stuff that hit the newsstand currently outdated already in a lot of aspects. So good to go over stuff at this time of year as we head into summer camp where you got a little bit of new information and stuff that we can share with listeners.
Well, let's get right into it. We're going to start in the Atlantic Coast Conference, in the Atlantic Division of that conference, and we're just going to go by the order of the standings from last year. So we will start with defending national champion Clemson. Clemson Tigers coming off a 14-1 season, culminating with their national championship win in dramatic fashion against Alabama back in January. So I think there's a couple things we need to look at when we look at Clemson. First is the fact that they did lose Deshaun Watson, so they're going to obviously be needing a new quarterback this season. And the second thing is, for the guys that hung around, what type of hangover can you expect from that championship, and what does Dabo Swinney have to do to really get this team ready for the season ahead? Because they come out of the gate with an easy one against Kent State, but then they're into the thick of it right away with a home game against Auburn, followed by a road game at Louisville the next week. So they don't have time to really find their footing and find their groove in the season. If they don't come out of the gate strong, they could be 1-2 in week 3 and done.
Yeah, no, very true, Robin. I'll tell you, when you break these two divisions down, you'll find that the biggest storyline between the Atlantic and the Coastal is returning quarterbacks, where the Atlantic side returns a bunch of talented starting quarterbacks. The Coastal side returns hardly any. I believe Virginia and Duke are the only two returning quarterbacks on the other side. Here, Clemson's one that doesn't have the returning quarterback. He talked about it with Deshaun Watson, so they're up against it right off the bat inside that so-called Elite Three in the Atlantic Division with Florida State and Louisville, Lamar Jackson and DeAndre Francois over there. But all indications out of spring, and I've said this on a couple of podcasts already, you know, when you follow spring football the way that I do, you come to the conclusion that everything is optimistic, everything is sunshine and rainbows for everybody, and we know that's just not the case, so you have to take the spring with a little bit of a grain of salt. But I'll say this, again, just as we will make one general blanket statement here on this podcast, Rob, and that is please don't put all of your belief when you go to bet these games into the numbers of returning starters. They're just not those numbers don't really apply to the success or failure of every single team. Some teams it means something, some teams it doesn't. In the case of the Clemson Tigers, who have now gotten to the stage where they just reload, they don't rebuild anymore. You've been in the national championship game 2 consecutive years. Obviously, Dabo Swinney's built a monster program here. So the fact that there's only 5 coming back on offense doesn't mean that Clemson is going to dip down. I think, obviously, Deshaun Watson is a key component here missing, and we'll see if Kelly Bryant can take over and at least be, turnover-free for the first couple of weeks, Rob, because I think if he can do that, the rest should be able to take care of itself. They have such talented guys at the skill positions, names that we know from last year. Hunter Renfrow, big catches in the national championship game. Ray McLeod, who hasn't really gotten a chance yet in 2 years to show off his abilities. I know that he's had some opportunities out of the backfield and with punt returns, but very limited. He's been stuck there in a numbers game. Deion Kane expected to be one of the best receivers in the ACC this year. He'll take the lead. The offensive line is really good. That's always important. So this, when you're talking about this type of offense, you expect Clemson one more time behind offensive coordinators Tony Elliott and Jeff Scott to be very, very productive. Defensively, they look good as well. They're pretty deep. They return 54 lettermen, which means there's a bunch of guys that have been in the program already and know the system that are just dying to step in and take over here. So Clemson, in power ratings, I don't generally, when the season starts, I don't generally make big movements upward or downward for any team. I have kind of a ceiling on how far I'll move them, either forward or backward. So I don't think Clemson loses too much in that regard, and I don't think that odds makers will view it that way either, Rob. I think odds makers will generally line Clemson about the same. They're going to line them a little bit less because Deshaun Watson obviously is a big-name player. Everybody knows who Deshaun Watson is. I like to say if my wife knows a player's name, then the whole world knows it. So she knows Deshaun Watson. That means that he's a big loss here for Clemson. Look for them to be heavily priced, totals to be high. I think, that Auburn game is really, really a crucial spot for them because with Louisville on the heels of that, I don't know which one, if in fact they'll focus on one more than the other, Rob. Auburn expected to be a top 10, top 15 type team this year, and they gave Clemson fits last year, so that's a tough back-to-back situation to be in early on. We'll know a lot about Clemson by that time.
And I think the one other thing, just looking at Clemson's schedule, they kind of draw a little bit of a bad break in who they have to play from the Coastal this year. They have to travel to Virginia Tech, and that's going to be a very tough game for them. So not the best draw there in terms of who they're going to play from the other division in their conference.
Yeah, I think they would have liked to have the Virginia Tech and Louisville game flip-flop, Rob, because Virginia Tech, obviously, without Gerard Evans coming back, they're one of those teams breaking in a new quarterback. And while Virginia Tech happens to think that Josh Jackson is going to be just fine stepping in and taking over here, if you have him in week 3 and in the very first ACC conference game, there could be some jitters for a new quarterback. And I think Clemson would much prefer to be playing Josh Jackson and Virginia Tech in week 3 rather than Louisville. By the time they get around to Virginia Tech, 5th week of the season, after playing, it'll be their 5th consecutive game, no bye week in between any of these. That makes it a little bit more difficult, but Foster's defense always good. So I'd agree. That's not the easiest of spots coming out of the Coastal Division, and especially the way, like I say, Clemson doesn't get a bye week or any break and having to play Auburn and Louisville back-to-back prior to that game with BC sandwiched in the middle. So it's tough. It's definitely tough. They've got the personnel to come through it. Point spread-wise, like I say, I wonder if any of those are good situations. We'll have to wait. I'm waiting on summer practices to see a little bit more, but I wonder if any of those are good betting propositions. Auburn certainly has a lot of returning talent, and maybe the fade party against Clemson will start early this season from bettors.
I think it most certainly could, especially if they don't look good against Auburn. You think there'll be a lot of fading of them on the road at Louisville in week 3. I mean, last year they played a very, very competitive game against Louisville and managed to come out on top. Of that was at home. Now you're going on the road with a new quarterback. It'll be his first road start, so that's going to be a tough spot. Win total on Clemson, very fair, I think, 9.5. They're basically asking, and the way I look at it is they've got 4 games where I think there's a chance they could lose. They could lose against Auburn. They could lose against Louisville. I think they could lose on the road at Virginia Tech, and I think there's a chance they could lose against Florida State at home. I think if you look at the number 9.5, you really have to ask yourself, okay, assuming there's no upset somewhere along the way, which we've very clearly seen with Clemson, there could be an upset along the way, especially last year. They almost lost, I believe it was to NC State. They caught a break in that game. They ended up losing to Pitt. So do you factor in that maybe Clemson drops one somewhere that they really don't have any business dropping? Then you look at those other 4 games, and you have to ask yourself, can they win 3 of those 4 games?
Yeah, and, I think that the talent says that they can. Because especially on the defensive side of the ball, you're talking about a couple of guys across the defensive front that are probably going to go first round of the NFL draft, and Dexter Lawrence and Christian Wilkins. Those guys will probably both go quickly off the board. To see them lose 3 of those 4, I don't know if I could see that happening, but I think you mentioned a couple other games that could be stumbling points here. NC State, and we'll talk about them in this podcast, is a sleeping I don't want to call them a giant, but they're a team that's a little bit under the radar this season because of the Big 3 in this division, and I think they're very, very good. And Will Muschamp, while his team is 70% freshman and sophomore, Will Muschamp has a quarterback in Jake Bentley, a team that comes off of an absolute hammering last year in that in-state battle against Clemson, and much better this year. So you never know how that one's going to go as well. I could see Clemson maybe winning 2, losing 2 of the Big 4 games, and then 10-2. Not really out that far out of the realm of possibility, even without Watson. They're that good everywhere else across the board, and they've got good depth. So once again, for those of you who are betting early season over win totals, it's a little bit risky for sure because you can't project injury down the road. I mean, if the quarterback situation has an injury to it, then Clemson could really be in trouble, and you wouldn't want to have an over ticket in your hand. So it's one that's got a razor-thin margin for error attached to it if you're going to bet over. But I do think that Clemson, they definitely could be a 10-2 team, no doubt about it. And the good thing for them, Rob, we know this from previous seasons, is hey, if you're going to lose early. And don't lose inside the ACC, because the ACC championship game, getting there is huge. If you lose the Auburn game in week 2, doesn't necessarily put them out of playoff contention, with Louisville on the road the following week, and then Florida State later in the year at home. So 2 wins there could put them right back in the ACC championship game and in the playoffs. So a lot of question marks here, a lot of ifs, ands, or buts. We'll have to play Clemson week by week. They open up against Kent State at home. That should be an easy one for them.
The one other thing I wanted to mention on Clemson real quick, and we'll move along here, I like the timing of the Clemson bye week. They're going to have a bye the week of October 20th. They play at Syracuse Friday night the 13th, so they really get 2 full weeks plus a day to prepare for the Georgia Tech offense, which is never an easy challenge, which is never an easy task. It's always a challenge to play Georgia Tech, just because they run an offense that you're not used to seeing very much at all. So I think the bye week is well timed for them to get ready for Georgia Tech, NC State, and Florida State in the back half of the season. I like where their bye week falls this year.
It's a good point, and obviously you're always looking to see if teams come in to play you rested or unrested. In the case of Florida State, when they go to play the Clemson game is sandwiched in between Syracuse and Delaware State. So you might say that, FSU will have a little bit of extra time to prepare as well for that contest. It's a good thing to always check these bye weeks and to see where teams are entering games. Like I said before, the Clemson Tigers, they might not be the 14-1 national champions this year, and maybe that will rest on the shoulders of quarterback play. But boy, oh boy, man for man, up and down this roster, and if we go to 2 deep, with the exception of that quarterback spot, this is a real good football team. I think Dabo's put something together.
Let's move ahead to Louisville. They are one of the biggest threats to dethrone Clemson this year. They are a very good football team. Their schedule, not an easy start for them. They play Purdue. I mean, Purdue is Purdue. They'll get by Purdue. But then before they play Clemson, they're at North Carolina. So they are also going to have a reasonable test before they get to play Clemson. So I don't really see, when you look at that Week 3 matchup, I don't really see a advantage to either team in terms of situation, other than Louisville's going to be the home team. It's always a good situation to be in. But other than that, I don't really see a situational advantage coming into the game for either team. Louisville has a bye week. I don't even know if you would say it's a bye week. It's very late in the season. They're going to take their bye the first week of November to get ready for home games against Virginia, Syracuse, and Kentucky. I'm sure they'd rather have the bye somewhere else in their schedule, if at all possible, but it is what it is. And what do you see with Louisville this year?
Well, obviously, Lamar Jackson is the big story for this team. They've tried to go through the spring to develop him more as a pocket-type passer. I think Louisville's afraid to run him too much this year, Rob. If there's one quarterback in this entire conference and maybe in the nation who a team's potential playoff hopes hinge on, it would be Lamar Jackson. So, in order to get him to become less of a runner, more of a passer, they tried in the spring, and they'll work on it in the summer as well to get him to throw from the pocket more, to get the protection to be good enough so that he doesn't have to leave. Obviously, he can make plays with his feet, and you don't want to take that away from him. Just the designed runs, I think, are going to be less for Louisville this year. He's got a good crew of receivers. Let's face it, when you have Jalen Smith and Reggie Bonifant and those guys, certainly guys will be open. And Jackson has shown us the arm strength. I think the consistency, the completion percentage is what Bobby Petrino really wants to see go up, especially on the downfield balls, because Bobby Petrino, his passing philosophy, he likes to call it downfield between the hashes. He likes to go vertical. There's not a lot of sideways stuff, horizontal, sideline to sideline with Louisville. He wants to make big plays off of the running game and over the top in the passing game. So I think that he certainly will be able to do that with these receivers. I think the biggest thing for Louisville, Rob, and the biggest thing overall in college football anymore defensively is the way the game is played. You have to have the ability to rush the passer and defend the pass. The front four, your front three, however many you have, whatever your alignment is, plus your defensive secondary, have to be able to both be good. You have to be good in both of those areas, and there's not many teams that are. And there's a handful of teams that are. In the case of Louisville this year, their secondary is going to be really, really good. So I think that's vital to their success here. I think Bobby Petrino would really like to see some improvement on the defensive end this season. Now, defensively overall only gave up 322 yards per game last year. Some people would put that on a soft schedule. Others will say, hey, they were really, really good. They've got the athletes. There's no doubt about it. But I think through the year in that secondary, they want to see a little bit more improvement if they get it. This could be a team that doesn't falter at the end of the season the way they did last year, losing to Houston second to last week of the year, and then Kentucky on the final game to really wreck what could have been an even better bowl bid. So I like Louisville. I think that the pass defense is a key here. Jackson should be Jackson. The offensive line, I think, is good enough to protect. And we'll just see if he can build some consistency here. If you're looking to play this team in a certain fashion, whether it be play on, fade, where the point spread is concerned, or whether it be over, under, where totals are concerned, the way odds makers, Rob, the way odds makers have jacked up these totals, it's hard to continue getting over the number. And I think if Louisville has a little bit of improvement in their secondary this year, perhaps they can stay a shade under the total this year. There might be some situations where we'll look to play Louisville under.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head with the secondary, especially when you're going up against a team like Clemson, who's got maybe a little bit of a question mark at quarterback, but a phenomenal core of receivers. If that secondary can step up in that game and contain those receivers, that could end up being the difference.
There's no question about it. And you know what? I know we're going to get to them next, but the one team in this division and conference that has that is Florida State. Louisville a bit unproven, but all experienced. And you expect experience to make that next step forward. So I would think Louisville will be better in that situation. They're going to face, like you say, the receivers from Clemson, the receivers from FSU. They're going to face good receivers from NC State. And when they cross divisions, which you mentioned earlier, you're going to play Larry Fedora's offense, North Carolina. Now, I know Mitch Trubisky's not the quarterback there anymore, and Brandon Harris, LSU transfer, is, and he's not the most accurate of guys, but the receivers are still very highly skilled, very talented guys. So they've got teams on their schedule that if they can keep quiet, and Syracuse with Dino Babers later in the year, right, that team will throw the ball around. If this secondary can come through, you need the defensive line, obviously, to get some pressure, too, because the secondary can only cover for so long. But I like the fact that all four guys are returning, and I think Louisville should be able to make a little bit of a step up as far as their everything's like hand in glove, so maybe their sacks get a little better because the coverage is better. Maybe the coverage gets better because there's more pressure on the quarterback from the front. They have that opportunity this year.
I got to tell you, I look at Louisville 9.5, and I look at Clemson 9.5. Put a gun to my head, I would say I'm slightly more comfortable taking Louisville over the 9.5 than I am taking Clemson over the 9.5. And I think that has to go back just to the fact that you've got a proven star, a proven player at the most important position on the offense, and I think it just gives them the slightest of edges, and I think their schedule sets up a little bit better. I don't think they're as challenged. I think if there's a trap game anywhere, it's their Thursday night game at NC State, obviously on the road at Florida State. I mean, right now, you put a gun to my head. I'm not saying looking at point spreads or anything. I would say Louisville beats Clemson in Week 3. So it's an early prediction for me, and I think that if Louisville wins that game, they do go over 9.5. I don't think there's more than 2 losses on that schedule anywhere else.
Yeah, they do
have to remember one other thing.
Yeah.
Louisville absolutely smoked Florida State at home last year. Absolutely demolished them. It could be that type of atmosphere again early in the season, and they just go.
Yeah, they did, and I think there was some reason for that, and when we get into Florida State, we'll go ahead and discuss it. But this team is as capable as Florida State and Clemson are of putting 40-plus on you every single week. The defensive issues are going to be the defensive issues. I would say Clemson's ahead of Louisville defensively right now, especially on the defensive line. I don't have to worry about Clemson putting pressure on quarterbacks. They're going to be all over quarterbacks. Louisville, we're hopeful that they can get some pressure to help that secondary out. If that works in their favor, they're going to be in good shape. Clemson gets Florida State at home. Louisville has to go on the road and play Florida State. It could be that triangle beats each other up, and then it comes down to the rest of the games like you were mentioning, and maybe the schedule does lay out a little more favorably for Louisville where non-conference is concerned, because I don't think that North Carolina poses the overall threat to Louisville that Auburn does to Clemson. North Carolina is obviously capable, but Auburn, this year with Jarrett Stidham at quarterback, could be a beast. So Clemson's going to have their hands full.
And I think if you just look, too, at the cross-conference game, so to speak, UNC is the game that Louisville has to play on the road against a division rival, whereas Virginia Tech is the team that Clemson has to play. I'd probably rather play UNC Week 2 than Virginia Tech Week 5.
Yeah, and you mentioned Georgia Tech earlier. Even though they're replacing quarterbacks, that offense difficult to prepare for. Clemson does have the advantage, like you said, of having the bye week heading into Georgia Tech, but Louisville gets Virginia instead, and Bronco Mendenhall of Virginia has told us already that we're not rushing this process. This is a rebuild, a grassroots rebuild, so you'd much rather be playing Virginia than you would Paul Johnson's Georgia Tech team. So there's some things here in Louisville's favor. It'll be a fun game right off the bat against Purdue because, remember, Jeff Brom is the new head coach at Purdue, comes from Western Kentucky. Jeff Brom was the offensive coordinator for Bobby Petrino. The philosophies are exactly the same. Purdue's going to come in and throw it all over the lot. Louisville's going to throw it all over the lot. So that'll be a fun game as well, and a game where, Purdue obviously is outmanned by Louisville, but Jeff Brom's offensive scheme could cause Louisville some trouble right off the bat. I think we'll get a decent gauge at least on how well the cover guys are and how good the pressure is for Louisville in that opener.
Well, let's move ahead and discuss the third team in the triangle, as you call it, of the elite teams in the Atlantic Division. That would be Florida State. Also posted at 9.5 wins for them in the upcoming season. They finished last year at 10-3. They finished the season strong, winning their last 5 games. And I don't think there's anything more to be said about Florida State's season. Can jump right into Week 1 against Alabama. We've seen what Alabama does in these games when Nick Saban has more time than you'd ever want Saban to have to prepare. They absolutely crushed USC last year. It was the finding of Jalen Hurts, and really Alabama never looked back from that point forward until it got to a national championship game, and they came up a second or two short defensively in that one. What do you see for Florida State, and with the core focus on, are they going to be able to beat Alabama in week 1?
Yeah, boy, there's a lot to look at with FSU, Rob. And I think if you start with that first game of the season, like you said, you get Alabama on a neutral field. You get Alabama in a season where the draft choices from last year's Alabama team into the NFL were plentiful. They've got a lot of places where some key components held positions last year and are going to be backfilled this year. Nick Saban obviously wins the recruiting wars every single year, so we're just going to see talented places put right into spots here this year for Alabama. But right off the bat, Florida State with their offense has an opportunity. I think the biggest question in that game, and maybe the biggest question for FSU all season long, will be the offensive line. Can they take care of DeAndre Francois? Again, a dual-threat quarterback who can escape some trouble, but you don't want him to be in constant trouble against Alabama. That'll lead to turnovers and, points going the other way. But they do catch Alabama at a good time. Let's face it. When you're replacing that many NFL players from a defense in game 1, it's an advantage. There's no doubt about it. Defensively, here's what I wanted to get at before, because you talked about the game where Louisville absolutely destroyed Florida State, and I didn't think this at the time. I know it was mentioned a little bit, but I don't think anybody thought at the time how much the injury to Derwin James at free safety was going to crush Florida State last year. Derwin James went down in about the second game, and I think everybody knew that he was one of Florida State's more talented guys, but nobody knew that the entire secondary was going to fall apart without him. Once he got hurt, you get 63 put on them by Louisville. USF scored 35 in that game. I think all 35 were in the first half. I think they scored on their first 4 drives. Quentin Flowers and company just went crazy on them. North Carolina the next week put 37 on Florida State. A couple weeks later, Clemson put 37 on Florida State. And it wasn't until the very end of the season when the defense really started to pick it up again. And this year they've got Derwin James back for the entire season. I think on the back end he is just so key. Like I said, I didn't realize at the time the effect. Usually, and we know odds makers aren't going to make a change in the point spread because you lost a starting safety. But it damaged Florida State's defense tremendously last year. I think they'll be so much better this year. Last year heading in, everybody was on the FSU bandwagon, right? They were supposed to go ahead and win this conference. They didn't. I would say this. A lot is at stake in that Alabama game. I had said earlier that if you're going to lose early because it doesn't throw you out of the playoff picture at all. And certainly if you're in a conference with a conference title game, like the Power 5 conferences are with the Big 12 jumping in this year, all of them have it. You have a chance to win your conference championship and still go to the playoffs. So game 1 isn't the be-all, end-all. But I always worry about a team psyche, like USC last year when they got beat 52-6 by Alabama. I think it did a little something to USC, and then they came on strong at the end of the year. You hope that Florida State, if they lose, doesn't get down. They only have UL Monroe the very next week, so maybe they could sleepwalk through that one. But when they face Miami of Florida at home in week 3, that's a danger game because Mark Richt has Miami on the ascent here, and that could be very, very difficult. Miami's going to be gunning for that one. FSU is a good team, and we've talked about 2 good teams prior to them. We've talked about how they face each other in this type of triangle, home and away. And they have the same win total for the year, 9.5. I think when we looked earlier, Florida State was minus 50 cents, probably the heaviest of all at 9.5. But their schedule lays out pretty well, Rob, and if they can get through that Miami game, I don't know that they'll lose more than 2. They'll probably beat Louisville at home, and even if they lose to Clemson at the end of the year, they do have to go to Florida. I mentioned earlier Malik Zaire, the new quarterback at Florida. That could be a little troublesome too. So the schedule has its spots, but Florida State should be really, really good this year because of all the teams we've talked about here. I guarantee they can rush the passer, and I guarantee their secondary can cover. So they have that entire defensive package, and I think that's what sets them above the other 2 teams right now.
Well, Rob, so we talked about the Big 3 or the triangle of the teams that you would expect to compete for the Atlantic Division. Underneath them, there are 4 other teams that all have different issues and different problems, and you look at them, you've got NC State, who finished 7-6. Wake Forest finished 7-6. Got Syracuse, who actually finished based on a tiebreaker ahead of Boston College in the standings, even though they were 4-8. That Boston College finished 7-6. So you got a group of 3 of the 4 teams there behind Florida State that had winning years last year. So before we get into the individuality of each of these teams, any one of those 3 that jump out at you as being able to contend with those 3 and make that triangle a square?
Well, I think if you had to pick one, you would pick NC State, just based off of last year's results. We saw NC State, although they were, pretty well whipped in total yardage in that game, but they did miss a field goal at the end of regulation, which could have won the game for them. Game went to overtime. You take Clemson to overtime, that's a big deal. And there was a lot taken out of the team that week, and, of course, they followed it up by getting blown out by Louisville. But if you look 2 weeks later, they only lost to Florida State by 4 points. Now, a lot of these teams, we've gone through the returning players here, a lot of these teams are the same. So for NC State to go to Clemson, lose in overtime, to have FSU at home only lose by 4, I think shows that Dave Doran has a squad that knows they can compete with these guys. Now, there won't be any type of fear factor. They're a little better this year than they were last year. I think when you get into the second year of the offensive system that they have with Eli Drinkwitz, who came from Boise State. And remember, Ryan Finley, the quarterback, came from Boise State with him. These 2 are familiar with each other. I would say that of those, and I do like Syracuse, we'll get to them later, but I think that of those 4, NC State really does have an opportunity to be that under-the-radar so-called team this season in this division.
Well, we're going to go to them next. They open up with SEC rival South Carolina, and they play Marshall, they play Furman, which that's a whole other story of why these teams continue to schedule teams like that. And you look at, they're lucky in that one of the road games, and it's going to be a tough one at Notre Dame. If they lose, it doesn't hurt them in the ACC standings because Notre Dame is technically still independent for football, even though they play 5 games against the ACC each year. They don't play a full ACC schedule. You look at their crossover games, and there's an opportunity there to win. I don't think they're going to be a one-loss ACC team, but I don't think that they're as, like you said, I don't think they're as far behind as last year's record would seem to indicate.
Yeah, and if you just go by what they produced last year and then know that they have 17 total starters back and 45 lettermen, Dave Doran was a good coach in the MAC, came over here, had to really straighten some things out, and now finally in year 5, it looks like the pieces are there. This is the best personnel he's had during his entire tenure. But when you look at the overall numbers from last year, you don't really get too concerned about the defense. That defense allowed about 23 points a game and only 353 total yards per game. Those are outstanding numbers for modern-day college football. The offense, the numbers didn't quite correlate. 417 yards and only 27 points. The 417 is probably going to go up. They're that talented, and the offensive line brings back 4 starters. So I think that if they push those offensive totals up, Rob, yardage and points, you're talking about a team that's not really going to be, again, when you're in a division with FSU, with Clemson, with Louisville, you're hidden. You're somebody else. You're one of the, the other 4 castaways, so to speak. Odds makers don't have to really adjust that much power rating-wise for this team because the public isn't really going to come with a lot of NC State money. They're not a team that's a big-name team. So you can get away, or you can get some value early on with them. I think South Carolina, it's a great week to catch South Carolina opening day because South Carolina, as I mentioned earlier, 70% of their roster is freshmen and sophomore. And while it's really improved and they're going to be much better than last year, especially with Jake Bentley at quarterback, NC State's the better football team. And so if they can get by that, then they go with Marshall and Furman. You're 3-0 when you hit at Florida State. And we'll see. Like I say, last year they only lost by 4. If I'm talking strictly from a point spread perspective, NC State plus a bunch of points in that game might look real good. We'll see what the number is when we come to it. But I like this team, like the way the defense sets up, really like Finley at quarterback. The quarterbacks we've talked about so far, right? We talked about Jackson, Francois for Florida State, and, of course, Clemson coming in with Bryant to start this year. And Ryan Finley, to me, is the purest passer of all of those quarterbacks, the most consistent passers. So they've obviously developed a real good ground game here under Doran. Jalen Samuels gets the chance to be the bell cow ball carrier this year. I like the team, and you have to really like the team if the odds makers don't make a huge jump in point spreads with them, and I don't think they will. I really don't. So maybe a little bit of NC State early on for us, and we'll react to, we'll counterpunch to the way the odds makers react maybe about week 4, week 5.
I mean, in terms of their schedule, I mean, I think you're right. They could be 3-0. I don't think they're going to win at Florida State, but like you said, the situation with the points could be right. Their bye week is reasonably well timed. I mean, they've got a tough schedule at the end of the year where they're going to play 4 of their final 6 games on the road, so they get a bye between Pitt and Notre Dame. Now, after the bye, they still got Notre Dame and Clemson back before road games against BC and Wake. They'll finish up with UNC at home. So it's not the easiest back end of the schedule for them, and you just have to hope that they take care of business early, have, let's say, at least 4 wins going into that back stretch to make sure that they're in a position to make themselves bowl eligible.
Yeah, which I think if they could get this 6-6 last year, certainly I think they can get the 6-6 this year. And those win totals, those season-over win totals, Rob, they're always so difficult because basically what the odds makers do is they go up and down the schedule and say, well, the games you're going to be favored in, we're going to treat as wins, and the games you're going to be underdog in, we're going to treat as losses. And when you go to bet and you look over the schedule, you basically look at it the same way. You look at, well, where can they win and where can they lose? And it makes the numbers really tight and hard to beat. You can't project what might happen during the season. Usually these numbers that are posted now, a lot of them aren't that close by the end of the season. You say, wow, how did I miss that? But injuries and stuff take place during the year that force these numbers to be off. With NC State, can they get to 8-4 and go over that 7.5? 7.5 happens to come with a plus 105 for this season. I'd be willing to take a shot on this team. Like I say, once again, because of the way odds makers make these numbers, the margin for error is just so thin. You can't have anything go wrong for your team. You almost have to have everything go right for your team. But if you're projecting ahead that this is a team you're going to asterisk and look to play on during the season, then you should be able to take a shot on them, especially at plus price. I think NC State has built some toughness. They're not going to be physically overwhelmed by Clemson or Florida State. They weren't last year. So I don't see any reason why that you can't look at them to be an over. The problem with a team like NC State, Rob, is that you're going to run into, because they're not as deep as the other squads, you run into flat spots. Like they could get murdered at Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's a good team. And they could get beaten at home by Syracuse if Eric Dungy and company come in throwing it all over the lot. You get more flat spots out of teams that aren't as deep, and NC State isn't quite as deep as the big 3 in this league. That's why they're ranked in most preseason annuals for 4th place here.
Well, that brings us to Wake Forest. Wake Forest, they have an interesting first 4 games. Presbyterian, at Boston College, home against Utah State, and then on the road against Appalachian State. And then they really get into the meat of their schedule after that. Their road schedule also includes a trip to Notre Dame, which, again, wouldn't count as a loss in the ACC standings. I mean, the fact, and this is one thing I always look at when I look at win totals. I always look at, okay, your hardest games are where, and your easiest games are where. And when your hardest games are at home, I always tend to give an edge to the under, and Wake Forest falls perfectly, even at only 5.5, falls perfectly into this system where their games are absolutely very tough at home. They have to play Louisville at home, they have to play Florida State at home, and they have to go to Clemson. So the fact that I'd say, okay, maybe they're a bowl team if they were playing at Florida State and at Louisville and home against Georgia Tech and Syracuse, but the schedule doesn't work out that way for them, and I'll just say right off the bat, when that happens, I tend to just situation them into a lean towards the under.
And that's where the money's gone, obviously, with this team. 5.5 under -145. Tough division. Like you said, schedule lays out. Obviously, the reasoning behind what you described just now as something that you look for as a system is, you want to have the easier teams on your home field because at home you got the crowd behind you, and the easier team, it's easier to win football games than bringing teams in that are better than you when you're going to be underdog to. Your chances of winning those games, upsets at home, aren't as frequent. So you'd rather play, when you're Wake Forest, you'd rather play the easier teams at home, the tougher teams on the road, especially when you're looking at the win-loss totals as a better. I'll say this. There's a lot of excitement coming out of the spring at Wake Forest, and one of the major reasons why this team had a lot of trouble offensively last year, and a lot of it was due to the quarterback position. They found their guy in Kendall Hinton last year. He gets hurt, and they had to go back to John Wolford, who had been the starter the year before. Not quite the quarterback that Hinton is, because Hinton brings the dual threat capability to this team. His feet can make a lot of plays. Their offense this year, for Dave Clawson, again, a guy who came from the MAC, pretty good coach reputation in the MAC. It's taken him a while to get things here going forward at Wake Forest. But we saw in that bowl game last season when they played Temple, 34 points, and an offense out of Wake Forest that all of a sudden, that 34 points came from like nowhere. Nobody expected them to score that way. What they did for the bowl game was they added some more spread principles to the offense, and they continued to add elements to open this offense up this year because they've got that faith in Hinton. The spring went well. For me, I've already got a buy signal on this team where totals are concerned. Wake Forest is a team that's constantly lined every single week, 42-47, which are outrageous numbers in college football nowadays because lots of times the opponent scores 42 or 47. But Wake Forest is going to be good enough to contribute to totals this year. They're going to be good enough to score points this year, and odds makers aren't going to raise them that much higher. So I think that for Wake Forest, that's a definite thing to look out for this year is the improvement on the offensive side of the football. They're always a team that tries to shorten games, Rob, which worries you a little bit when you're playing overs. However, like I said previously, head coach Clawson has gone ahead and added a lot more openness to this offense, wide open style to this offense. So I don't know if slowing down games here is going to be the way it has been at Wake Forest, where you try and run and grind clock and, can we just be in the game in the fourth quarter? I think they got a little bit different approach on the offensive side this year, and the defense is usually steady enough to keep them involved. I think if these totals continue to be lined the way they've been for Wake Forest for years now, we might be able to catch a team that gets up and over the total quite a bit, especially, that Temple game just caught my eye last year in the bowl. Temple, a very good defense. I know that Matt Rule was gone at the time and perhaps a little bit of letdown by the players, but to score 34 when you're Wake Forest on Temple, that was a real big accomplishment last year. It carried over to the spring, and it's probably going to carry over to the summer sessions here.
I mean, I don't think that even an improved offense, I look at the schedule, and I mean, even give them the benefit of the doubt in a game or two, I don't see 6-6 again. It's not there for me. I don't think that, they're going to win week 1, and then after that, at BC, home against Utah State, at Appalachian, they got to take probably at least 2 of those 3, if not all 3, to have a shot at the bowl, because after that, Florida State, Clemson, at Georgia Tech. Granted, they have a bye to prepare for Georgia Tech. Still a road game. Home against Louisville, at Notre Dame, at Syracuse. It's not going to be easy. Back a couple games, NC State and Duke, you might be looking at them needing to go 2-0 in those games to get the 6 wins.
Yeah, from a straight-up perspective, there's no doubt. I think that Delaware on the schedule last year and easy games that they don't have this year. You mentioned Appalachian State. That's a good team. With no offense whatsoever last year, 0 offense, let's forget about straight up and whether they can go to a bowl game for a minute and just talk about how we cashed tickets here. They're 8-5 against the spread last year with no offense whatsoever. With an offense and with the assumption that odds makers don't change the lines on their games, if you're getting, just for instance, if you're getting 35 from Louisville last year, you're probably getting 35 again from Louisville this year because nobody's going to bet Wake Forest in that game. So with that assumption that they're going to be lined the same way, they were 8-5 against the spread with no offense last year, and now they have their quarterback back, and they've opened up the offense a little bit. I think the point spread perception of this team and the straight up whether they make a bowl game or not perception of this team are completely different. They're not always different for teams, but for this team in particular, I think they could be very, very different. You should be able to cover some spreads with them. But more than any of that, I just think that this is a team that when the line comes out on Sunday night and I see a Wake Forest game over under 46, I'll be one of the first guys betting over 46 until odds makers adjust or until I'm just proven wrong. Just because I'm saying it doesn't mean it's right. And I've been hit over the head and run into a lot of brick walls in my time, 25 years doing this stuff. So you could be wrong. But right now, as we head, towards the end of July and into fall camps, I think Wake Forest, that's the way to look.
Well, it'll be interesting to see. It's definitely some good theories. I think that if they're at home and they're getting 3 touchdowns against Clemson or a Florida State's probably a spot to most certainly at least take a look at playing Wake Forest there. Always have to remember the letdown factor of some of these teams that are going to go through a gauntlet of other tough games. You see a Wake Forest team on the schedule, and it's just natural that you take a little bit of a breath and go, okay, we got past Florida State, and now we got to go play Wake Forest. And, it just happens. You can coach against it all you want. You can tell your guys not to do it. And the bottom line is it's still going to happen. So I'm absolutely with you there. There could definitely be some spreads down the road that we could look at to make ourselves have a play on Wake Forest. Well,
yeah, it's great to know, Rob, real quick. It's great to know that if you're Wake Forest, last year, you only had to score 12 points to cover against Louisville. You only had to score 13 points to cover against Clemson. You only had to score 6 to cover against Florida State. In none of those games did they even score 2 touchdowns, yet they're 3-0 against the spread. And that's the stuff that, public bettors don't really like to take the chance on. But for us that have been in the game for a long time, you're just trying to uncover certain things that nobody else is looking at. And right there, the 3 elite teams in the ACC Atlantic Division, 0-3 against the spread against Wake Forest last year. So a lot of that has to do with what you just said. I think they use Wake Forest as their look-ahead game. Always check the scheduling, though, because, one of those weeks, those 3 teams might really need to put on a performance and a half to impress the pollsters or the voters in the new playoff system. So everything is put on an individual basis. But it's nice to know that you don't even have to score 14 points in order to cover a game.
Great point. And now let's move ahead to Wake Forest. They are the only team that finished under 500 in their division last year. And you look at what they did, and they kind of had a shot at one point in time to make a bowl game. They got themselves to 4-4 with 4 to go, and then they just didn't even bother to try against Clemson, 54-0. They lost a tough one at home, and I think this is kind of what broke the back. They lost the game at home against NC State. They absolutely had to win. They weren't competitive against Florida State, and then a basketball game broke out, and they lost 76-61 at Pitt. So that's how their season ended. But they were there. I don't think they were as bad as 4-8. They had a very good home win against Virginia Tech. So, I mean, the talent was there to at least play competitive football here and there throughout the year. I wouldn't say there were a lot of bright spots, but, I mean, that was definitely a bright spot at any time you can win a game on the road, which they managed to do that twice last year. They won at UConn. They won at Boston College. So, I mean, not all is lost with Syracuse as far as I'm concerned going into this season. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I happen to like them this year, Rob. And I think a lot of my like for this team is my belief in Dino Babers as the head coach here. Obviously, Dino Babers known as one of the top offensive minds in college football right now. His systems produce some more points and yards. Last year, he came into what was kind of a bare situation, and he wasn't going to try to play to his personnel in his first year. He basically made the personnel adapt to his system right off the bat. It ended up in 4-8 straight up. It ended up at 5-7 against the spread. Their totals are outrageous. I think that Pittsburgh game at the end of the year, if I recall, it was either 79 or 80 in that game, the total. So they're up there. Everybody knows this team can score, but I think in year 2, what you're looking for if you're Dino Babers, and from everything I saw in spring and continue to read now, they think that their defense has made strides. It's what you have to do. If you're Dino Babers, the defense has to be the so-called anchor for this team. The offense is going to do their job. But when you score 76 yards in 3 plays, defense is going to be out on the field a lot. He has to build numbers. He's done a pretty good job in his first couple of recruiting classes here to do that. And I think incrementally they're going to improve. Now, one more time here, in this particular division, you're covered. You're hidden behind those top 3 teams. Nobody thinks twice about, like we said earlier, NC State, Wake Forest, Syracuse. Nobody's thinking about those teams. I think that this team can play games a little bit closer. You mentioned a couple where they played, actually beat Virginia Tech on tough in some other games, put up 33 against Notre Dame. They were in that one for quite a while. But the defense was the weak link. They just couldn't stop anybody. If they can do half of what the coaching staff is saying that they can do as far as improvement is concerned, like I said earlier, coming out of spring, everybody believes that they're in contention for a title, especially a divisional title. We know they're not, but we also know that this team can get us 5 touchdowns in most spots, and if the defense can hang on here a little bit, I think they're going to cover some games. Like I say, it's a team I like because I believe in Babers, and I like the defense to improve here. Eric Dungey, I talked earlier about Finley maybe being the most accurate quarterback. Lamar Jackson aside, Dungey's the most explosive quarterback in this league. I would, people would argue me DeAndre Francois, but I really think Dungy as a dual-threat quarterback. He's more consistent throwing the football, and he's excellent with his legs. I just think he's probably the second-best quarterback in this particular division, and he can carry a squad. So we'll see what happens, but expect Daber's team, once again, to score a lot. Expect the totals to be high. My power rating, I did raise Syracuse this year. I don't know that odds makers have, but I raised Syracuse a little bit based on the fact that the defense looks to be a bit improved.
Well, that leaves us with one team, actually, as I mentioned earlier, finished with a better record than Syracuse overall. Finished the season on a high note, and that's Boston College. You think they can carry over that strong finish into the 2017 season?
Well, they were sitting there trying to get that bowl bid last year, right? And they get murdered by Florida State, but then they look at the schedule and they see UConn and Wake Forest for their last two games. All they had to do was win those two, and they were going to get to a bowl. They did win those two, played two teams that were about as inept on offense as you could possibly be. They blasted UConn. They beat Wake Forest by a field goal. Now, this year, Steve Addazio, again, these bottom four teams are all, in my mind, improved. Boston College is going to get Darius Wade back at quarterback. Now, Darius Wade is a kid who started a couple of years ago for BC. Last year, remember that he went to the bench because they had the Kentucky transfer, Patrick Tolles, who came in and became the starter. And Tolles he was really erratic. The offensive line wasn't BC quality last year, and the offense just kind of suffered. They didn't run the ball well. Normally, it's a staple of Boston College to run it well. They went down to 3.4 yards per rush last year. I think a lot of that has changed for them. The entire offensive line is back. Darius Wade will not be listed as a starter or as a returning starter in most publications, but like I said, he started 2 years ago. He was their number one quarterback. The injury sat him down. I like him, dual-threat quarterback once again. We know that Addazio has really good defenses all the time, so they're going to be like a rock on the defensive end. This is another team, Rob, I think that the theme we've carried out with NC State, Wake Forest, Syracuse, and now BC remains the same. They're teams that aren't going to be pumped up as far as point spreads are concerned. Odds makers will probably leave them neutral to where they ended last season and let the season play out. So if you have belief in any of these teams, get them early. They're going to play at Northern Illinois, good MAC squad right off the bat. Then they're going to play Wake and Notre Dame at home. They're a lot like Wake Forest. If they generate any offense whatsoever, they could be good. Their defense is probably a little bit better than Wake Forest. So I wouldn't go so far as to say, like I did with Wake Forest, that I really like the thought of playing over in BC games. I like the thought of playing over in Wake Forest games. BC, I think that defense can be so rock solid at times that it makes games tough to go over. But as far as point spread is concerned, Steve Addazio's got a good group here. 15 returning starters. I call it 16 because of Wade. They should be able to run it a little better, throw it a little better. I don't know. They're a team to look at. Out of these four, like I said earlier, I like NC State the best. I think they have the most top-end talent, and they're probably the deepest of all four of these teams. But certainly BC, again, last year you're talking about a team that went 7-6 against the spread. Can they do it again? Absolutely, they can do it again.
And I think we'll see right off the bat again with BC. They have to. It's a weird road game. They're going to play at Northern Illinois. Northern Illinois is not a good football team, and that's just the game that Boston College is going to have to win. They can do that. Then they get Wake at home. That's winnable. They're going to get Notre Dame at home. Probably not going to win that one. Clemson on the road, probably not going to win that. They get Central Michigan at home. They got a chance there. And then you look at the back half of the schedule. They get their bye late in the year, but again, it could work out well where they're maybe sitting at 4 wins and need to win 2 of 3, or maybe they're really lucky and they're sitting at 5 wins and only need to win 2 of their last 3, which are home against NC State. They play UConn in a neutral field, and then at Syracuse. I mean, 6 wins again isn't out of the realm of possibility for them.
They seem to be lined real low, considering as we look at it. The difference between, for Wake Forest to be sitting at over under 5.5 and BC over under 4, I think to me it's a little much. If you were going to play either one of those 2 teams, you would certainly jump on the BC over 4. It's a low number. There's a VIG that comes attached to it, minus 130, but you just broke it down pretty well, Rob. 2 MAC teams on the schedule that they can beat. They can go to Northern Illinois. Northern Illinois has been the class of the MAC for a lot of years, and then last year they weren't. Last year they fell a little bit. Central Michigan, a team that's beatable at home. That's 2 right there. Wake Forest, a team that's beatable at home. They beat them last year on the road, so in week 2, can they beat them at home? Certainly they can. That's 3 wins, potentially, by the time you hit October. They get to go to Virginia. Just talked about how Bronco Mendenhall is piecing things from the ground up. Virginia's a mess right now. You can make Virginia your 4th win and then come to the end of the year, like you say, Connecticut and Syracuse last 2. I think if you're going to take a shot on any of these teams as far as season over-under wins from a straight-up perspective, BC over 4 is probably a real good one to look at because of the way that schedule lays out. Defensively, those teams we mentioned as possible wins, they can shut all of those teams down. They can shut down UConn. They can shut down Northern Illinois, Central Michigan, Virginia, and Wake Forest. That's 5 right there. So I think that if you're looking for a team out of this group to go over the total with, maybe BC is the best of the bunch.
Well, Rob, that takes care of the Atlantic. It's been fun. It's been an early look. We've got a lot more to cover. We're hoping to crank these out at least 2 a week. Probably going to need to go to 3 a week at some point if we're going to get through it all. We've all got a lot going on, but we are going to do our best to get through as much of these big conferences as we can, and then if we have a little time left over, we can look at the MAC and the AAC and Mountain West and Sun Belt and get into some of the lesser conferences where there's still a big opportunity to make money because odds makers spend even less time on those conferences than they do on these big conferences where there's a lot more public attention and a lot more money being bet. So don't want to neglect those conferences. If we have time, we'll absolutely get to them. Rob, plug the website for us. Tell us what's going on over there and what our listeners can do to get ready for football season.
Yeah, obviously you want to go to robvenosports.com. That's the website. You'll be able to hear the podcast from me and Rob all season long. We'll also get those. We'll get you a link over to YouTube for the podcast if you missed it. You can always get it. You can go back during the season and listen to these, especially these preseason previews of conferences and individual teams. Statistically, I don't know that there's a better website out there for football statistics. I've been doing them by hand for 25 years, and now we have a little help in that regard. But certainly statistics that are meaningful to bettors, not just general statistics that you'll find on other sites. So you want to go to Rob Veno Sports for that. Where once football starts, be a lot of free plays there, a lot of stuff going on. You'll also, of course, each and every week want to get involved with the football selection packages from myself, from Rob O'Connor, from Derek Davis. All of us follow college football intently, so you want to go ahead and purchase and join in if you would like to win a little bit of cash this year. So a lot going on. Once again, take a look, robvenosports.com.
Absolutely. RobVenosports.com is the place to go for all of your paid selections this season. You want to get some free tips, go there. If you're trying to develop your own selections, RobVenosports.com is a great resource for statistics. It's a great resource for injury news. It's a great resource for weather. RobVenosports.com. For Rob Veno, I am Rob O'Connor. This has been an early look at the ACC Atlantic Division. We'll be back again soon to take an early look at the ACC Coastal Division. Till next time, keep listening. May all your wagers be winning ones.